Welcome back to Sledgehammer Horror, guys. I am Ken Sledge, and let's talk horror. Now, today I am so lucky because I'm joined by the amazing duo of Dylan Newell and Luke Janesco. How you doing today, guys?
Great. Awesome. Glad to be
Very
here, man.
good.
It's a huge honor.
Yeah. Oh, dude, the honor is all mine. Now, before we talk about the reason that you guys are here, I would like for the people that don't know you to get to know you guys a little bit. You guys met while working at a used media store back in 2016. Quickly learned that you both shared a deep interest in film and filmmaking, with the genre of horror being obviously the drug of choice there. After a few attempts at making a podcast and YouTube channel, you guys finally, you wanted to discuss horror movies. That was where you guys was really the most deeply rooted, was discussing horror movies. So the decision was made to take the focus on primarily horror content. So when you guys first started out, were you doing just like all movies, or were you trying to do just like how did it go when you guys were first getting started?
Luke, you tell the story better than me, so I'll let you get into it because yeah, we were doing way too much. Like,
Okay, yeah. So Dylan and I had initially an idea for a podcast, and I had the name By Admission Only, and I was like, I just want to kind of cover all films and just a more so a film appreciation. And Dylan was on board because we would find ourselves at work just discussing films. So we started out slowly just doing the podcast and everything, and then we overextended ourselves in a sense where we were starting to see every new release. So we were at the theater every week trying to do these reviews. And it was before the pandemic and everything, so we didn't really have the workflow we do now of us both being at our homes, being able to hop on at our convenience. We were really just actually physically meeting. So we would go see a film and then try to line up either late that night or the next day to meet up and do the podcast. And it just, it became so tiresome that we ended up having these long breaks in between. And then I believe we did what we called the Carpenter cast for By
mhm.
Admission Only, and then we just went through John Carpenter's filmography. So a completely long podcast, but so much fun. And we found out that most of the time we were so eager to talk during the podcast when it was horror. So as we were still doing By Admission every so often, Dylan came up with the idea of Splattercast and kind of doing more horror centric things. And is when it was what at the very beginning of the pandemic is when, of
Mhm.
course, that's when you start a podcast,
Right?
is at the very
Yeah.
beginning of a pandemic. So we had done a few episodes there. And again, we were still physically meeting at that time every so often to do the podcast. I think we got what 3 or 4 episodes
I
in,
think it was about 4 episodes, yeah.
and then again we took our break. We had a lot of stops and starts here, and then Dylan went off and had a baby. Like, of course he would do
Yep.
that. And then
Idiot.
shortly after that, I followed, and I believe I remember this text where I had texted Dylan jokingly, and I had said I just found out I was having a girl, and I had texted him and said, I'm having a girl. And then a little while later, I said we need to start a horror podcast called it would be a mix of horror and dad's learning how to dad, and it would be called Binkies and Butcher Knives. And Dylan said we really got to get Splattercast back up and running, and we set a date, we bought mics, and we discussed werewolves, of course, of all things, to really start it.
Right.
And ever since then we've stuck with it, and we're here. What Dylan, is it uh a year, and is it almost 2 years?
We're
No,
getting close.
yeah, getting
May will
close
be
to
two
2 year mark.
years. But
Yeah,
yeah,
so
no, so we're about a year and probably like 10 months. So yeah, it's going good, man. I've been really happy with it. I mean, with all those stops and starts, I mean, it happens. We talk about it all the time, especially because we also this year just did our first officially, we did it. We got our first short film done. Obviously horror. We're getting ready to put it up on the channel. It won an award, so like that was super humbling, just in our own backyard here in Akron. And like that was it's been a lot, but honestly, like it just all I think fell in place at the right time. It's all right place, right time. We both became fathers. We both had the trial runs, and now we're here. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way looking back on it.
Well, and what you just talked about, having the short film on the channel, the good thing is you guys don't have to go searching for it because I
Mhm.
have the channel link and all their social media links down in the description. So make sure you're going, make sure you're subscribing to the channel, make sure you're checking out their short film. I can tell you from experience, just because it's a short film doesn't mean it's a short process. So make sure you're going, you're checking these guys out, you're showing them love, let them know what you think of the short film, because if you're making art, you got to have an audience for it. And I hope that we can bring that audience to them to check out the short film. So what's the name of the film?
Sycophant is what we went with. Yeah, it's got a demonic painting. We have a trailer up on the channel from a couple months ago, and I'm just putting the final touches on the sound mix, and I'm hoping to have it up, if not before the end of the year, then shortly right into 2024. So,
well, by the time this airs, it should already be there. So
it
I'll have
will
the
be.
link for the movie right down in the description. So you can just click the link, subscribe while you're there, and watch the short film. So I do want to say, we eventually got to get it to the point to where you guys are just doing a separate segment on Splattercast called Binkies and Butcher Knives, where you do child-centric horror movies, because that would be fucking dope. Like, that would be so sick. So if you guys ever decide to do that, please let me know, because I think that would be absolutely amazing, just to have your own little offshoot of the channel called, Binkies and Butcher Knives, and just, doing, like I said, child-centric horror. That would just be so sick to
Oh,
watch
we'd
you guys.
I'd be so down. My son, he's almost 2, and like the kid's obsessed with Chucky. Like I was watching the TV show. He's just a little tiny thing, just looking up at it, just staring at Chucky, like I don't know what the hell's going on with that. And now, anytime we see him in public, you go out to Spirit Halloween, especially. Go to the Chucky section. He's just like, I love him. It's like, that's Chuck. He just says that's Chuck, and it's he's down, and I know Luke, he's got his stories too with Ella. So
Oh yeah,
Well, here in about
Dylan.
16 years, I'll have to have him on to talk about Chucky.
there you go. Yep.
And then for me, so uh my daughter's just over a year now. Dylan, on the channel we cover, Dylan suggested covering Thanksgiving every Thanksgiving. So last year was I was introduced to this. Dylan already knew about it, but my daughter was born November 3rd, and I'm prepping for Thanksgiving, my first watching, and I'm holding her. And she's a newborn, doesn't really pay too much attention to anything. And I took a picture of her and sent it to Dylan. It was the first time that she had ever actually paid attention to something on the TV. And of course, it's a killer turkey.
Right.
But Zoom crops this off so you can't see it. But right here in my background, I have a chair, and in that chair sits a replica Tiffany doll. So as soon as she's old enough, that will leave the seat and go to her. So she will grow up with Tiffany in her life, with the wedding dress and in the leather jacket. So yes, we're both steeping our children to be deep in the horror space.
Gotta love it. Got you start them young, man. That's how they know the difference between right and wrong, by watching horror. So,
There you go.
and like I said, here in about 16 years, I'll have them both on to talk about their first horror movies. And hopefully with her, we will not be talking about Thanksgiving, because I don't want to talk about that movie ever. So we know, what you guys are doing now with Splattercast and becoming dads, and how important that is. Horror is amazing. Being a father is way better. So I'm glad that you guys get to experience one of the most amazing things a human being can experience in this lifetime. But now I do want to go back to the past and talk about how horror started for you guys. Your first horror movie. And Dylan, I'll start with you this time. Your first horror movie was.
It's technically, if I really am honest, it's probably Jaws, but I don't consider it a pure horror film. So I went with the movie that turned me into a full blown horror fan, which was Friday the 13th, the remake from 2009. Changed my world. I got me completely into slashers. Watched that, and like it just literally, that's where everything went. Started going home, looking up things on YouTube. Dad was renting films from Netflix. Like it, that whole summer was all just horror films.
Well, that's a great start to your horror life too. One of the better first acts of a remake of all time. So,
Absolutely.
what about you, Luke? What was your first horror movie?
Well, mine, I grew up, my parents let me watch horror movies even as a kid. So, horror was always on the television as I grew up. My dad was really deep into Stephen King, still is today. So, Stephen King properties were always on the television. But for me, the thing that I always remember and that I always go back to is Leprechaun, starring the wonderful Warwick Davis. That was something that for me was always on the television at certain points. The opening scene there where, the door creaks open and he walks down the stairs and then he's, counting his gold. I remember vividly that being on, my bedtime's like 9 p.m. and my dad was putting us to bed and, so we're giving him a hard time and, bedtime's at 9, so it's probably what 9:15 at this point, and I'm watching Leprechaun, and he's got to put me to bed, and I'm just avidly defiant, saying I have to watch Leprechaun. So it was one of those that I watch bits and pieces of it. And then eventually my mom would, I'm a video store kid, but getting the VHSs. We lived, the video store was right up the street for us. So I remember my mom, after seeing that beginning of Leprechaun, saying, I was like, I have to go rent this. And my mom, of course, being the great mom that she is, took me up there and I was able to rent Leprechaun. And then, after that, I'm not sure what Leprechaun 2 came out, but I know I eventually got that one too. So I was deep in the Leprechaun space as a kid.
Oof, that franchise, man.
Hey, then they went to space. So
there you go. Yep.
That's a stressful franchise to get through. So we know that you were both young, watching these movies with your parents for the first time. But Luke, what was the scene from Leprechaun that you would say affected you the most?
Probably that affected me the most. I always remember that very beginning there, but what affected me the most was the kill with the pogo stick. And that's why I love Leprechaun. Dylan can tell you I always have a volatile relationship between with comedy and horror. Sometimes for me, I don't feel like it's melded just right. Leprechaun's one of those elements, a film that has those elements where I think, they have the perfect equation of comedy and horror, really implementing the terror. Because you look at that scene, the pogo stick scene, if I describe it to you, it seems just so wacky and weird that you don't think it would be scary in any sense. But I think as a kid going into that, how gory it is. And I mean, yeah, sometimes the effects don't hold up, but, even going into it, I can still find it humorous, but also terrifying. So that scene for me just sticks out. Anytime anyone talks Leprechaun, I always go back to that pogo stick scene.
And I think that's probably one of the most memorable scenes from the very first movie. I think that that's one that really, really sticks with a lot of people when they talk about, the grand scope of Leprechaun. So what about you, Dylan? What was the scene from Friday '09 that affected you the most?
It's that whole opening. I mean, it sold me so hard on the Friday the 13th franchise. And, growing up and getting more familiarized with, Friday the 13th, it is my favorite slasher franchise, and everybody's got their one. And, that's obviously mine. And I think that reflecting on it, it encapsulates that whole series, in 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes. It's a very solid. We're just going back to the roots of it. Just people going out camping, looking for pot, having sex, and then getting hacked to death by Jason. And I mean, it's just like probably one of my favorite interpretations. Like, I gotta be honest, my favorite film in the franchise is part 6. After it's all said and done. But I mean, that whole opening, that's what I was just like, I get slasher films now. I understand the appeal. This is great. This is fun. This is scary. It's just like and every time I watch it, it's always just that opening just flies by for me. I'm just like, this is so good. Like, I love everything about it.
Well, that opening is its own short film. If you end the opening with that machete swing, that's the perfect ending to a short film right there. So I've always said that I think that that's one of the best first acts of any Friday the 13th movie. Part 6 is my second favorite, but I'm also the weird guy whose favorite is Jason Goes to Hell.
That's perfectly understandable.
That movie. Like, adore that movie. I could go on a tangent about what that movie means to me and talk for hours about it. And everybody that watches knows that. So I'm not going to get into that because we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you guys. So, talking about Friday the 13th and the impact that it's had. I know that the 6th one is your favorite. I know that the remake was your, the way that it started for you. But, remakes, sequels will always happen. We're getting the Camp Crystal Lake show done by A24.
Oh, yeah.
Now the original Friday the 13th, I always ask, would you like to see your first horror movie remade? '09 would be kind of hard to remake, but would you like to see them try to make an attempt at the original Friday the 13th and make a straight remake out of that one with the Mrs. Voorhees character?
Yeah, I would like to see the take on it because I think it would be very different. But at the same time, I completely understand why studios and anybody who gets the rights to this are so afraid to touch that. And I think like the way that they've done it, like in 2009, it makes sense to kind of make it that nice, quick little intro. But it's to me, I think that that film affected people because of that twist. Nobody saw
Yep.
Pamela Voorhees coming. Everybody says that. That's what everything is. And I don't know if it would have the same effect, but I'd love to see what kind of a twist they would put on that now. Like, how would they change it up? If we're going to go straight to the roots of it, go back to the original Friday the 13th, at that point, change it all, whether it's Pamela, whether it's Elias that we've heard so many things about in the background. Like, let's really see what you guys can do with that. Maybe Pamela is got Elias with her. Maybe it's the parents of Jason instead of just that. It's like there's a lot of different ways you could do it. Do I ever see it actually happening though? I mean, I think we'll have to wait and see how Camp Crystal Lake does. I know they're talking about making this kind of a prequel, remake,
Yeah.
sequel type deal. So if they go back to do it, I think that'd be really cool. But yeah, I would be down for it. I would not be opposed. But I'm actually a big proponent of remakes. I think that it's always nice to see somebody take their spin at it because we always have the original, no matter what. My favorite
Yeah.
horror movie of all time is a remake, and that's John Carpenter's The Thing. So there you go.
See, and I think that and I've been saying this for like 10 years now. I want to see a remake of the original Friday the 13th with Kathy Bates playing Mrs. Voorhees. I
She'd be
think Kathy
great.
Bates, I just picture like the mom from The Waterboy mixed with Misery. Like that to me would just be the perfect Mrs. Voorhees, man. Like, I think she would be great. Her or if like with the Camp Crystal, like I was hoping they would get like a Mia Goth to be a young Mrs. Voorhees. I thought that would be dope.
She'd be
Or
great.
if you're
Yeah.
doing a remake, could you imagine like Toni Collette
Mm-hmm.
being Mrs. Voorhees? Like, oh my god, like oh my, Kathy Bates or Toni Collette. I think those they would just absolutely fucking nail that shit. So, um, we do get a bunch of Leprechaun movies, and Leprechaun to me, it's funny because my favorite in that whole franchise is the newest one, the sci-fi one, Leprechaun Returns. I think that movie is fucking solid. Like it's so good. Sci-fi original movies have a very good way, especially when they do the remakes. Whether it was this or Slumber Party Massacre was really, really well done. The remake, but in the Leprechaun franchise, Luke, because obviously we're talking about your first horror movie being Leprechaun. Which movie in that franchise would you say is your favorite?
It's got to be the original. I mean, it's the go-to there. You had mentioned it's a little bit of a rough franchise to get through, and I think some installments are stronger than others. I think the one constant there always that we can say is the shining light is Warwick Davis.
Oh yeah.
He always brings a great performance, even when we get into the wackier sides of Leprechaun, but that first original, like I had mentioned at the very beginning, I think is a great mixture of comedy, horror. Whereas, like, yeah, I think as we get further into the installments, we get wacky, we lean a little more heavy on the comedy. Where, for me, I'm it's a little more personal to me because I do love the first one, so I'm gonna always defend most of the other installments, regardless of origin. But so I think looking at that original, I think it was a great starting point where you look at it and there's a great lore there where, I love the idea of him shining shoes, which, eventually gets lost upon the rest of the franchise. They don't really establish any more lore. I like when they go into, he's trying to find a wife and things like that. But I think that first one really did a great job of establishing his lore, but also bringing almost a seriousness to that actual creature effect. And then Warwick Davis bringing his personality to it. So, I think, the first one's always going to be unmatched, but I do have a love for the sequel as well. I think that one, while not as strong as the first one, I think it's a lot of fun. I think more so where it starts to fall off for me is when they do go to space. Because that one is really where, for me, you kind of jump the shark and you dive pretty deep into a lot of comedy and we're really getting into those wacky areas. But sometimes, it fits with that Leprechaun franchise sometimes. But, I always got to go back to that original. And I know they're talking about potentially, doing something in terms of Leprechaun space. We covered it on the channel. And I wouldn't be opposed to it. If Warwick Davis wants to come back, I would absolutely, I don't think anyone's getting their arm twisted to have him back. But if he didn't come back, he doesn't want to do it anymore, I say, we can breathe some fresh life into it and see where we go. Because I think there's a lot of gas left in the tank for the Leprechaun franchise.
I don't know
I
who
like the guy,
is,
the newer one. I
yeah,
thought he did
Yeah.
a really good job. And like I said, that's my favorite one in the whole franchise. Like after watch, because I seen Origins and I was like, I'm never watching another one of these fucking movies again. Because there was so much potential. Like, why would you have Hornswoggle be the leprechaun? I'm gonna go on a tangent if I do that. But I agree. I think that especially if you watch that last one and you see how they go back to the horror, making it a straight requel, you cancel out everything else, you just go right from after the first one. I thought it was fucking great. Like it was so good. So I could see them definitely breathing new life into it and making something more fun again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and for me, like I watched Leprechaun Returns, and I was very guarded because I think prior to that I had watched Critters came out with the new one, Critters Attack, and I was like, oh, I'm so excited. We're getting Critters and Leprechaun, and I watched Critters Attack, and I was like, well, okay. And then I went to Leprechaun saying, well, it doesn't have Warwick Davis in it, so I don't know how I'm going to feel about this. But I was really surprised. I love the performance
Yeah.
by the actor that they picked for Leprechaun. I was a little upset at the beginning. I'm not going to spoil anything, but with a certain death, but I got over that, and I think they kind of melded where sometimes in modern times they want to use more modern things, but I think they melded that perfectly where it didn't feel like they were trying too hard, and they still kept that tone of the original, I think. So I was really happy with Leprechaun Returns.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I enjoyed it too.
fantastic.
I thought the guy they picked did a really good job. And I gotta say it's the directors of that. I think they're the Psycho Gorman and the Void team, wasn't it? Or at least one of them. So yeah, no, I think that they're a very solid pick for that. And I enjoy when you give somebody who's already established themselves in the horror space, like with a beloved cult film, the chance
Yeah.
to work on a franchise. And I think that Leprechaun's the perfect one to keep going back until we can hit that formula again.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to see them build off of that movie. I think that would
Mhm.
be absolutely awesome. So, as horror fans, we love the death. Kills are something that means a lot to us. Dylan, which kill from Friday '09 would you say is your favorite of the bunch?
I mean, there's a ton. I really enjoy a lot of them. I know I gave a specific answer, but I can't remember exactly because it always switches in my head. But I think the sleeping bag burning and that is pretty intense. It's also kind of like a nice callback to the one that they tried to do with the sleeping bag back in the day where he was slamming it against the walls or the tree and stuff. Um, I mean, there's so many. It's got to be that, or it's got to be the boyfriend getting pulled through the floor in that opening too. I think that one's really solid. It's just really brutal. It's just like really one of
Yeah.
those ones where it's like he's just screaming and like it seems like he's not. I don't know if he's stabbing him or if he's just like literally ripping through him. So it's like but it's really most of those I thought were presented really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially like you said for that first act, like you are so ready to go after that first act. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh yes, we're pedal to the metal right away. So, Dylan, you answered this question a little earlier, so I won't get to ask you this question, but I don't know your answer yet, Luke. So we talked about your first horror movie and what it means to you, but now my little buddy Ghostface is here, and he has a question for you. What's your favorite scary movie, Luke? What is your favorite horror movie of all time?
For me, it's got to be Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. That one, like I said, my dad is a big Stephen King fan, so I was introduced to that one at a really young age, and for some reason, it really affected me heavily. It was something that really sat with me in watching it. And it's so weird because that film is pretty slow moving, and for that to catch the attention of I was probably maybe 8 at the time. I don't know. But for me to actually sit down and watch that film, I don't know. There's something about it. The Grady twins always stuck out in my head. That scene where they flash in with, all the gore that's in the hallway was something that really always stuck with me. And it was something that was, terrifying to me. And, uh, growing up with Chucky and Leprechaun, that was kind of my speed in a sense, where it's like, that kind of comical horror. But then when you get to something that is so serious and so daunting, I think in a particular sense as well. It was just something that had absolutely stuck with me, and the pattern on the carpet that is so popular with everyone. It's just something that I always gravitated back towards. So it was always, I owned the DVD, I owned, Blu-ray, I owned 4K. It was something every time that format came out of that film, I had to own it. It was always, at the top of my list. So it's something I always went back to, something I still go back to. I revisit it a few times every year just because there's so many scenes, from the pacing, everything for me, it just absolutely works.
Mm-hmm. And that's a movie that I've always said it's a master class in acting. You look at Jack Nicholson, who's this phenomenal comedic actor, and his chops in The Shining is just ridiculous. Like, the way that he's able to perfect that movie is just so fantastic. And we know that yours is John Carpenter's The Thing, Dylan, but what I love about The Thing is it's the perfect storm of everything, really. It's got phenomenal practical effects. It's got top-notch acting, the most underrated score of any horror movie ever. So, you talk about how, a remake can still be special. Absolutely. And that's one of the best of all time.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a movie that I saw it for the first time not knowing it was a remake. So it's one of those things where it's like, for so long as a kid when I saw that, that was one that I watched on like the Fox movie network. I think it was a thing back in the day. And it was just, they were like mildly uncut. I think they were mostly uncut. There was a couple things they cut out, but it was great. Like, it was just one of those films that my dad threw on and was like, "Oh, you love monster movies and everything. This is gonna blow your mind." And he was absolutely correct. Like, I mean, like I said, I was a Jaws kid, I was a Jurassic Park kid, but now I have this Alien, and I love Alien. I grew up with Alien before The Thing, but to see an alien like this, that's a body snatcher, that like can
Yes.
not only not have this definitive form, it's like it changed everything. And you're right. I mean, I loved Kurt Russell growing up already, so it's a win there. But as I get older, and as I was getting older and started to actually study the film and learn about its history and really start to appreciate all of these wonderful character actors. I mean, the character of Childs is just one that I always just like, I'm begging, because NECA's been putting out all these McCready figures. I'm like, I need a
Yeah.
child. I need one so bad. And it's like, I love Keith David so much, and like he's always one of my bright spots from that film. Him, Wilford Brimley. I mean, the scene of
Wilford Brimley.
him just sitting there in the shack, just saying, "I'm all right. I want to come back now. I'm all right." And you just know he's not all right. He's
Right.
something's wrong. It's just like, it's great. I love it.
There's something wrong, and this was pre-diabetes Wilford Brimley. So
Yeah.
there was definitely something very wrong. Um, so I've had an amazing time talking to you guys about how horror started for you, your favorite horror movie, Splattercast, the soon-to-be, hopefully, Binkies and Butcher Knives. But before I let you guys go, we always bounce back to the same question. We're going to go back to your first horror movie, and what we're going to do is rank this on a skull count. Now, we're not ranking it on acting, production, score, direction, nothing like that. We're not being critics. What we're doing here is strictly ranking this movie on how much it affected you on your first viewing. So, Dylan, we're going to go back to Friday the 13th. What ranking would you give that 0 to 5 skulls?
Oh, I mean, it's got to be a 5. I mean, it's the movie that got me into the slashers, that really set me on this journey of just saying, I love horror. Like, this is my spot. And for that, I will always have a special place in my heart for that film. And it's like, I can understand why people could be kind of pretentious and be like, oh, it's not great. It's, part of the Platinum Dunes era of remakes, and they're contentious. I get it. I like a lot of them, but to me, it will always get that pass. I mean, even if you're asking me to be a critic, I'm gonna sit there and probably give it at least a 4.5, 5 stars, because I do love it. It is, again, it's that opening is the quintessential Friday the 13th remake, and the rest of the movie's not that bad either. They got a lot of good ideas in there. Derek Mears is definitely
Oh,
up there
yeah.
for me as one of the best Jasons. I'd love to see him come back. I really hope they could bring him back at some point down the road now that we got the ball rolling. But yeah, dude, it's a 5.
I, I I get it. My first horror movie was as well. So, what about you, Luke? What would you give Leprechaun?
Well, Dylan already took 5, so I'm gonna go 5.1. It's off the scale, is what it is. But for me, looking back at that, like Dylan said, Leprechaun for me was something that started my horror journey. And I always look at that no matter what I do see, everyone talks about elevated horror and all these things nowadays. And there's so many different subgenres in the horror space. And, no matter what, the constant is Leprechaun is my comfort blanket where no matter what, if I'm struggling for something to watch, I always go back to Leprechaun. I can always turn that on. I can come in and out of it no matter what. And there are films out there that you look at The Shining. I want to put on a turtleneck, pour a glass of scotch, and reflect on my viewing of The Shining. Whereas more so the Leprechaun, I just want to put on a horror t-shirt and get on my computer and start writing, and I think that kind of gets something that hits the creative nerve for me, where it's something, it gets me excited about an idea that I have, or something that I've been thinking about. It really hits that nerve. So Leprechaun for me, it gets me excited to watch other horror films. It reminds me of how great the horror space is in terms of how wacky it can be, how terrifying it can be. So yeah, it's got to be off the chart. 5.1 for me.
I love it. So I do want to remind everybody, I do have all their social media links and the YouTube link down in the description. So make sure you're subscribing and checking them out. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It helps our channel more than you know. And follow Sledgehammer Horror on social media. Our links are in the description as well. Gentlemen, don't go anywhere. I got a couple more questions for you. Everybody else, as always, keep talking horror, stay what you are, and we'll see you guys soon.